Cheikh Anta Diop was born in 1923 in the village of Thieytou, Senegal. From a young age, he was immersed in the oral traditions of his Wolof culture, while also excelling in formal education under the French colonial system. In 1946, he traveled to Paris to study physics, chemistry, and philosophy. But it was there, far from home, that Diop began to ask questions that would reshape how the world understood Africa. What was Africa's true role in the history of human civilization? And why had that role been erased? Research like Cheikh Anta Diop's matters because it doesn't just correct footnotes in history, it rebalances the story of humanity itself. For centuries, colonial scholarship minimized or erased Africa's contributions to world civilization, presenting the continent as a passive recipient of progress rather than an originator of it. Diop's findings that ancient Egypt was an African civilization and that Africa played a central role in the birth of science, philosophy, and culture force us to rethink the foundations of our current history books. They reveal how much of what we take as universal history is in fact a narrowed Eurocentric narrative. For African people, his research was a tool of empowerment, restoring pride in a past that had been deliberately obscured. For humanity as a whole, it's an invitation to see history more truthfully, more inclusively, and to recognize that our collective story is far richer and more interconnected than we've been taught. Even today, if you open most school history books, you'll notice a quiet distortion. Ancient Egypt is often taught as if it floated outside of Africa, more connected to Greece and Rome than to Nubia or the broader continent. Great African civilizations like Mali, Songhai, or Great Zimbabwe get only passing mention if they appear at all. This selective storytelling is not accidental. It's the legacy of colonial education designed to place Europe at the center of human progress. What Diop exposed is that this isn't just a gap, and it's a deliberate erasure. By proving scientifically and linguistically that Egypt and other great civilizations were part of Africa's story, he showed how much of global history has been cut away to preserve a Eurocentric view. Correcting that bias doesn't only serve Africa, it serves truth itself. Diop was more than a historian. He was a physicist, an anthropologist, a linguist, and above all, a relentless truth seeker. His training in the sciences gave him a rare advantage. He applied rigorous empirical methods from radiocarbon dating to melanin dosage tests to questions of African history that were often dismissed as unscientific. At a time when mainstream scholarship portrayed Africa as a continent without history, Diop challenged Eurocentric narratives head on. He argued that ancient Egypt, long celebrated as the cradle of Western civilization, was fundamentally an African civilization created by Black people. In his groundbreaking 1974 book, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, Diop dismantled the colonial myth that Egypt was somehow separate from Africa. Using archaeology, linguistics, and even physical anthropology, he showed deep cultural and genetic links between the Nile Valley and sub-Saharan Africa. The history of Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians dare to connect it with the history of Egypt. What Diop is saying here is that Africa's story has been deliberately fragmented. Egypt was carved out of Africa in Western narratives, treated as something other. Diop insists that until we reconnect Egypt with the rest of Africa, history itself remains distorted. For Diop, this wasn't just academic, it was political. Colonialism had thrived by convincing Africans that they had no history worth remembering. Restoring Africa's role in human civilization was, in his eyes, a necessary step toward restoring African dignity and sovereignty. The African origin of civilization is both a scholarly intervention and a political manifesto. Published in 1974, it confronts the Eurocentric narrative that had long severed Egypt from Africa and denied Africans a central role in human civilization. Diop marshals evidence from history, linguistics, anthropology, and science to argue that ancient Egypt was not only part of Africa geographically, but also culturally and racially, built and led by Black Africans. Diop begins by critiquing Western historians who position Egypt as somehow Mediterranean, Oriental, or other. For centuries, colonial scholars portrayed sub-Saharan Africa as without history, and Egypt as an exception, a great civilization that couldn't possibly have been African. He identifies this as an ideological distortion. Colonial powers needed to delegitimize African history to justify enslavement and colonization. Diop argues that reclaiming Egypt as African is not just about the past, but about psychological and political liberation in the present. Diop provides multiple lines of evidence to establish that ancient Egyptians were Black Africans. He cites classical sources like Herodotus describing Egyptians as black-skinned with woolly hair. Egyptian tomb paintings and statues often depict Africans in ways consistent with sub-Saharan populations. Biological evidence, he uses physical anthropology and later melanin dosage tests to show Egyptians shared traits with Black Africans. Cultural similarities, practices like totemism, matriarchy, and spiritual cosmologies link Egypt to wider African traditions. For Diop, Egypt was not an isolated miracle, but the culmination of a long African cultural continuum. Diop places heavy emphasis on linguistics as evidence. He compares ancient Egyptian words with Wolof, his mother tongue, and other African languages, finding structural and semantic similarities. These links suggest not only contact, but shared origins in the Nile Valley and West Africa. His conclusion is that Egyptian civilization was part of the same family as other African societies, not an outlier. A core section of the book examines how Western definitions of civilization were racialized. For Europe, civilization meant Greece and Rome. But Diop shows that Greece itself acknowledged debts to Egypt, particularly in mathematics, philosophy, and science. By severing Egypt from Africa, colonial historians created a false genealogy of Western civilization. The book's title reflects its structure. The myth is the colonial claim that Africans were incapable of creating high civilization. The reality is that Egypt, one of the world's earliest and greatest civilizations, was both African and Black. Diop insists that acknowledging this reality forces us to rewrite world history from a more balanced, decolonized perspective. Diop closes by turning from history to politics. He argues that reclaiming Egypt's African identity has real-world consequences, psychological liberation. Africans must shed colonial inferiority complexes, cultural unity. A shared historical root in Egypt can serve as a foundation for pan-African identity. He advocates for African unity and independence, drawing on a common heritage to resist neo-colonialism. Diop didn't rely on rhetoric alone. He set up a radiocarbon dating laboratory in Dakar, the first of its kind in Africa. He also developed linguistic research showing deep connections between ancient Egyptian and modern African languages like Wolof. His use of physical anthropology, controversial at the time, aimed to prove what colonial scholars denied, that the builders of the pyramids were Black Africans. In practice, nations whose past has been stolen are nations whose future is threatened. Only historical truth can restore dignity to a people. Here, Diop makes it clear that history is not simply about the past, it's about survival. If people are convinced they have no heritage, they can be more easily dominated. Restoring historical truth, therefore, is not a luxury, but a foundation for freedom and dignity. This blending of science and history was revolutionary. It meant Africa could reclaim its past not through myth, but through evidence. Diop wasn't just a scholar in the ivory tower, he was politically active in Senegal, often clashing with the ruling elite. He argued for African unity and self-reliance, advocating for a federated Africa with a common language, culture, and economy. His ideas placed him squarely in the pan-Africanist tradition of thinkers like Kwame Nkrumah and Frantz Fanon. Though often sidelined politically, his vision inspired activists and intellectuals across the continent, especially in the fight against neo-colonialism. Today, Diop's influence is everywhere in African universities, in debates about decolonizing education, and in cultural movements that seek to reclaim African heritage. His research laid the groundwork for what we now call Afrocentric scholarship, insisting that Africa must be studied on its own terms, not through the lens of European colonialism. Egypt is to the history of Africa what Greece and Rome are to the history of the West. This is Diop's most radical point. Just as Western culture constantly references Greece and Rome as its roots, Africa too has a cradle, and it is Egypt. By reclaiming Egypt as African, Diop places Africa at the heart of world civilization, not on its margins. In an era of global migration, identity struggles, and renewed fights over historical memory, Diop's work resonates more than ever. He reminds us that history is not neutral. It is a battleground, and reclaiming it is part of reclaiming freedom. Diop's legacy is sometimes caricatured, dismissed as overly nationalist or speculative, but his real contribution was methodological. He showed that Africa's past could be studied with the same rigor as Europe's. He opened the door for generations of African scholars to stand on equal footing in global academia. These are the key takeaways from the book. Ancient Egypt was a Black African civilization, deeply connected to the rest of Africa. Western scholarship deliberately distorted history to deny Africa its rightful place in civilization. Linguistics, anthropology, and archaeology all support Africa's central role. The stakes are political. History is power, and reclaiming it is essential for liberation. In 2025, debates about decolonizing education echo Diop's project. Discussions of race and identity often overlook how deeply colonial history shaped our collective memory. Diop's work remains a call to use science, culture, and scholarship as tools of liberation.